Welcome, everyone. My name is Lauren Falkenberg, and I am the Senior Associate Dean in the Haskayne School of Business. And we are here on the topic of how is Federation working today, a scorecard. Prior to starting, I would just like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot and the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai, the Tsuut'ina, and the Stoney Nakoda First Nations, including Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nation. The city of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. This is a very exciting morning, and it's even more exciting in the fact that we are honored to have Dick Haskayne here, and the lucky people at table 5 get to have breakfast with Dick as we enjoy this talk. So thank you, Dick, for coming. And it is Dick who opened the door for us to have Tim Hearn come today. So that's really important. So today we have Tim Hearn, former chairman and CEO of Imperial Oil, Robert Mansell, Research Fellow, School of Public Policy, Emeritus Professor of Economics at the University of Calgary. Just a couple of points. Today you're going to see a lot of data, really good, interesting information. Those PowerPoints are actually now posted already on the Haskayne Hour website in the archive section so that you can pull them down at any point if you go there. You also have this card on the table, which is the card to, in a sense, leave with you, and it lists the economic goals of the Federation on the back of the card. Also, Robert will be referring to a number of studies, and they are on the School of Public Policy website. So with that, Tim, can I turn it over to you?
Thank you very much, Lauren. Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to a discussion on how our Canadian Federation is working today. Now, I know many Albertans feel it is not working very well for them or for our province. And according to a recent poll, 62% believe Alberta does not get its fair share, and only 18% of Albertans believe the views of Western Canadians are adequately represented in Ottawa. Given the huge losses of incomes and employment, the disappointment, frustration, and anger felt by many Albertans is obviously quite understandable. Some of this is serious enough to motivate even some talk of separation. However, our approach today is a measured one in which we evaluate performance against fundamental regional outcomes that one should expect in a well-functioning federation. And this is done from an Alberta perspective. In other words, we've taken an evidence and fact-based approach to this issue. In this way, it is hoped we can better identify and address the key shortcomings. We should also keep in mind that the solutions may require changes beyond addressing the problems Alberta finds with the functioning of our federation. It may also require us to rethink our own Alberta policies, such as those that do not take into account the variability of revenues that are exacerbated by the volatility of a resource-based economy. At the end of our presentation, you'll be asked to score how we are doing as a federation. So this means you're going to have to pay attention. You're going to be asked, and you will also be asked for your ideas on how to make things better. So let's start with the basics. There are two important foundations of a well-functioning federation. The first is a shared set of common values or history across the member regions, which anchors an emotional commitment to Canada. The second is a set of economic elements that translate into the well-being of the regions, being greater within the federation than being outside of it. A conflict in claims is said to exist when one or more regions do not see any net economic advantage to being part of the federation. Obviously, tensions can arise from conflicts in values and/or in claims, and while there may be some tensions in Alberta related to conflicts in values, our assessment is that the fundamental issue is a conflict in claims for which we will focus on today. Now, there are 5 core economic goals of a federation, and it is these that we use as a benchmark in assessing how well this is working for Alberta. And you'll see these listed on your table. The first is that it should provide stabilization in insurance to offset the instability associated with regional specialization, the latter of which is a key determinant of comparative advantage and overall national gains. For example, the cyclical resource industries, for these industries, federal policies should offer greater overall stability for the region and certainly should not be destabilizing. The second is equal treatment of equals, or horizontal equity, such that similar regions receive similar treatment in terms of net fiscal contributions and benefits. Vertical equity means a consistent progressivity going from the poorer to the richer regions. For example, while we would expect overall federal fiscal policies to transfer incomes from the richer to the poorer regions, we would not expect the burden of these transfers to primarily and disproportionately fall on just one region. The third goal of the Federation should be to minimize barriers to interregional movements of goods and services, as well as for the interregional movement of capital, labor, and technology. This is important for the well-being of the provinces and of the nation. It includes the facilitation of transportation infrastructure to allow efficient and timely access to provincial and international markets. Fourth, by acting together, the Federation should maximize the leverage and power in negotiating international agreements, such as those governing international trade, tax, and so on. And finally, by sharing costs and economies associated with national infrastructure, it should reduce the overall cost for individual regions and for the nation. So we care about the achievement of these goals because they have a direct impact on current and future levels of overall well-being of our citizens, including incomes, employment, and public services. Put differently, when these goals are not met, the result is a lower per capita incomes, higher unemployment, reduced government revenues, higher tax rates, greater inequality, and a lower value of our currency. To the extent that these impacts fall disproportionately on a region, it generates conflict, frustration, and alienation, all factors that undermine the integrity and sustainability of the Federation.
Good morning, everyone. Canada, as you know, is a federation of provinces and territories, and the division of powers and responsibilities are set out in our Constitution. As a federation, then, regions matter. Both in terms of governance and in terms of the overall well-being of the residents of the regions. So how are we doing overall in Canada? A common measure of overall well-being is the Human Development Index. It takes into account life expectancy, education outcomes, per capita incomes, and so on. And on the chart, you'll see the index values for 2015. What stands out is the relatively small differences in well-being across the regions relative to other countries, but also relative to the large diversity in our country. So overall, one can say we're doing pretty well. But what these measures don't capture is the real pain and suffering associated with shorter-term variations in regional economic performance, such as the serious and prolonged downturn that Alberta has been in for some time now. The implications of the downturn, and more specifically, the distribution of federal fiscal balances, is very much related to trade patterns. I would emphasize that Canada is characterized as a small, open economy, and Alberta is even a smaller and more open economy. And in those economies, trade is the lifeblood. First of all, just in terms of international trade, on the chart you'll see the green lines, and the green lines show the green bars show the net international trade balance by province. So for example, in Alberta, you'll see that there's a net trade balance of about plus 15, which means we export more than we import. The only other province that has a positive international trade balance is Saskatchewan. The bar for Alberta for any other year, for example, 2014, would be even more dominant. This is largely related to the comparative advantage we have in the resource sectors. So how is this important for Canada? Without a large net trade balance by some regions, how do you pay for the large net deficits, internationally speaking, for the other regions? And you'll see the green bars for Quebec and Ontario, large net trade deficits. So that contribution by Alberta cannot be overemphasized. Clearly, without that, the value of our Canadian dollar would be much lower, all of our imports would cost more, interest rates would be higher, and so on. So Alberta's performance does translate into benefits elsewhere through international trade balances. The red bars show the interprovincial trade balances. So for each region, it's what you sell to other regions minus what you import for other regions. Quebec and Ontario run large trade surpluses with other provinces. Virtually every other province runs a deficit. This is important because, for example, when you transfer through fiscal policy money out of Alberta and it goes to Ontario, not much comes back. Ontario complains about their net contribution, but historically, when you look at these trade balances, when money comes out of Ontario and goes to the Atlantic region, a lot of that comes back through these trade balances. As I'll note in a minute, the impact on Alberta of the federal fiscal balances is amplified by these trade patterns. So what do these net federal fiscal balances by region look like? The net federal fiscal balances for each region, the total amount of federal revenues in all forms, income taxes, GST, and so on, minus all the federal money that comes back to the region in the form of expenditures or transfers to individuals, firms, and so on. And this graph shows the totals for, if you look at the red bar, it's the total for 1961 to 2017, all measured in 2017 dollars. So for Alberta, you'll see our fiscal balance was a little over 600 billion. For Ontario, a little over 700 billion. These are the net contributors through federal fiscal policies of all forms. The net beneficiaries, Quebec to the tune of 500 billion, 300 billion Nova Scotia, 200 billion New Brunswick, Newfoundland, Manitoba, 100 billion Saskatchewan. There is an interesting paper by Trevor Toom and Jennifer Winter, two of my colleagues at the Policy School, and they show that when you take into account the trade balances, the effects in terms of the transfer of income, of economic activity, income, employment, and population in Alberta is amplified. For example, over the period to 2016, they estimate that it amounts to a decrease in real income in Alberta of 8% and a decrease in employment of over 12%. And obviously, the gains are to the other regions. For the maritime regions, very substantial, anywhere from 25 to 50% as a result of these transfers. Quebec, 5%. One could argue that you can't really make these simple comparisons because Ontario has 4 times the population as Alberta. So to compensate for that, let's look at it on a per capita basis. So this shows, the red line shows the net average annual net per capita fiscal balance for the period 61-2017. The blue lines show the more recent period, 2010-2017. And you can see there that, for example, over the period 2010 to 2017, the net transfer from Alberta on average is about $5,600 per person per year. So you think of a family of 4, that's about $22,000 is a net transfer. In total, on an annual basis, it's $20 to $30 billion per year. $20 billion per year, if you want to think in round numbers, that's like at $100 per person wage, that's like 200,000 jobs. So these are substantial amounts. people often think of, well, this is just due equalization. I want to emphasize equalization is embodied here, but it's not the dominant reason behind these large fiscal balances. So what can we say about the Federation in terms of stabilization? There are many gains from a well-functioning Federation that arise from allowing regions to specialize in what they do best, but offsetting the inherent greater variability. Over the period 1961 to 2017, our analysis shows that on average, there has been greater stability across most provinces. And part of this is due to what we call automatic stabilizers, employment insurance, even the tax system. They vary with how well people are doing. In the case of Alberta, federal fiscal policies taken as a whole have not been very stabilizing, and in some cases have been very destabilizing. Most recently, we've got some examples of the stabilizing policies by the federal government. One could look at 2015, where the provincial government got $251 million as part of the fiscal stabilization program. One of my colleagues, Dr. Bev Dalby from the school, has done an op-ed recently, in fact just the last week or so, on the need to reform that. That is not nearly enough, given that Alberta suffered an $8 billion drop in 1 year in terms of its provincial government revenues. As part of the 15 regions that received extended employment insurance benefits in 2015, Alberta had 4 of those regions. That amounted to a transfer of just under $700 million. The federal government will mention the $4.5 billion purchase of Kinder Morgan. More recently, there was a $1.6 billion in loans made available. So anyway, what I want to leave you with is a message that equalization is important, but stabilization for a province like Alberta that has a specialization in volatile regions is even more important. And even more important when you consider that while we look at the unemployment rate, that's gone from 5% to 9%, now down to 8% in Calgary, that doesn't reveal the true cost of the downturn. Net interprovincial outmigration, 31,000 people. Without that, unemployment rate would be much higher. The labor force participation rate down 2 percentage points. That's a lot. That is a huge impact. GDP down 12%. GDP per capita down 16%. Market income per worker down 7%. Insolvencies up another 20%. Non-residential investment down 39%. There is a very strong case for more federal attention to the issue of stabilization.
So the second pillar that we want to talk about is important is regional equity. And the question is this goal being served? Let's look at whether provinces with similar per capita market incomes, that is, incomes before taxes and transfers, receive similar treatment in terms of per capita net federal fiscal balances that Robert showed earlier, and whether there is consistent relationship between these balances and the differences in per capita market incomes across the regions. That is there both horizontal and vertical equity? Now, the Constitution outlines specific goals with respect to regional equity, which says the Government of Canada and the provincial governments are committed, first, to promote equal opportunities for the well-being of Canadians. Secondly, further economic development to reduce disparity in opportunities. And finally, provide similar essential public services of reasonable quality to all Canadians. It also says that Parliament and the Government of Canada are committed to the principle of making equalization payments to ensure that provincial governments have sufficient revenues to provide reasonably comparable levels of public services at reasonably comparable levels of taxation. Now, with this chart, we can evaluate how we're doing on that goal by plotting the relative fiscal balance of each province against the relative per capita market incomes of each province. Any province below 100 on the vertical axis is a net beneficiary, and any province above 100 is a net contributor. So you can see that in this chart, BC, Ontario, and Alberta in that time frame have been net contributors. As shown overall for this period, all provinces except BC, Ontario have been net beneficiaries. In other words, federal fiscal policies have transferred incomes, employment, and activity to them. For Alberta, the largest net contributor, has contributed much more than Ontario has, even with similar per capita market incomes. Put differently, Alberta has made much larger net fiscal contribution than other provinces with similar per capita incomes, and much more than progressivity would require, so there is a case for both horizontal and vertical inequity in the case of Alberta. If I redid this chart and just took the time frame from 2010 to 2017, you would find that BC and Ontario would be about $100 on both the vertical and the horizontal axis. They would move down for the last 7 years to around where Quebec is. And Alberta would be about up to $200 on the vertical axis and about the same, or a little bit above, to the right, 130 on the horizontal axis. So it's even been more exacerbated in the last 7 years. It is interesting to note that there has not been loud complaints from Albertans about their large net contributions until more recently with the serious downturn in the provincial economy. Something obviously has changed. Is it the absence of any recognition of these contributions combined with a series of federal policy measures such as Bill C-48 and Bill C-69 that have targeted Alberta's well-being and the apparent tone deafness in Ottawa to Alberta's economic challenges? Robert?
One of my colleagues, Trevor Toom, has done an interesting analysis of looking at the factors underpinning the outsized net federal fiscal contribution by Alberta. And this graph shows it for the period 2007 to 2016. You'll see that roughly 50% of that gap is due to the above average incomes by both corporations and individuals in Alberta. And it's not just because weekly earnings are higher, which they are in Alberta, but it's also that Albertans have work the longest hours, they have the highest labor force participation rates. Until recently, we were about 25% above the national average. Just in the last few years, we've fallen down to about 8% above the national average. So this doesn't capture the more recent period. You'd find a much smaller contribution associated with personal income tax and corporate tax. But anyway, over this period, 50% of it's due to the higher incomes, the higher provincial, higher federal personal income taxes and corporate income taxes collected in Alberta. Canada Pension Plan net contributions, we pay a lot more in than we ever get out. Net non-defense purchases by Ottawa, much smaller than on a per capita basis than other provinces. Equalization, stabilization counts for just over 5% of that difference. GST and excise taxes, because we consume more in Alberta with the higher income, contributes about 5%. OAS benefits, 5%. Other factors, for example, until 2015, most people don't know this, the per capita health and social transfer from the federal government to Alberta was about 15 to 20% less than every other province. That was corrected with the last year of the Harper government. EI payments, less receipts. We pay in consistently more into EI than ever comes back to this province, $1 to $2 billion per year. When you add all that up, that amounts to $20 to $30 billion per year net outflow. We can't get away with not mentioning equalization. I want you to think about stabilization more than equalization, but because equalization is always the headline news, I gave you the payouts for the 2 years, 2018-19 and 2019-20. Since 2008, Quebec and Ontario have gone from 50 to 70% share of the roughly 17 to 19 billion distributed through equalization per year. At the same time, the drop in the amounts going to the Atlantic region is 35% to 20%, and that going to the West, which means Manitoba, 20 to 10%. So a much larger share going to just the two central provinces. I want to emphasize that there's lots of problems with the equalization formula. Unfortunately, the government in the last budget decided we wouldn't reopen it. Let me just mention that it's focused on equalizing revenues. It doesn't pay any attention to equalization of costs of providing these services. The cost for public services in Alberta is 10% above that, and at least 10% above that in every other province. As a result, or partly as a result of that, you will find that by most measures, doctors and nurses per 100,000 population, student ratios, social services employment, and so on, we're near the bottom. Now, one could argue that we could raise that by taxing more in Alberta, but the point is, because the equalization formula doesn't take into account the real bottom line in terms of this goal of comparable services, we actually have to pay a lot more just to get the same level of service as you would in the case of Nova Scotia or provinces like that. Let me finally turn to free trade and factor movements across the regions. This should be clear-cut. In the Constitution, Article Section 121, all articles of growth, produce, or manufacture of any one province shall from and after the Union be admitted free into each of the other provinces. Well, that's kind of a nice way of saying that the fathers of Confederation had it right. They wanted a true common market. They wanted a nation, not a notion. 150 years later, what do we have? We have made some attempts. We had the Canadian Internal Trade Agreement back in 1995, and then that in 2015 became the Canadian Free Trade Agreement. We've got the New West Partnership Agreement now involving Alberta, BC, Saskatchewan, Manitoba. Ontario and Quebec are talking about removing barriers. The Council of Federation, or the provincial premiers meeting recently, had a document to address this issue, 345 pages. Half of it is exemptions, the free trade agreement. So what does that mean in terms of bottom line? Barriers to interregional trade in Canada are often greater than the barriers for international trade, which is a problem for international trade when, for example, trading partners have more difficulty in getting trade involving more than one province than they have between nations. These barriers are estimated to cost the equivalent, or be the equivalent of about an 8 to 15% tariff overall. In some sectors, for example, financial services, as high as 36%. The estimated annual cost is up to $130 billion per year. And you can find many, many examples of this. But I want to draw attention to the fact that these do not include the cost due to constraints on interprovincial transportation capacity. In the case of oil alone, since 2013, these losses to Alberta have been in the order of $40 billion, 1% of Canadian GDP. If we added in the barriers to transportation of natural gas, we've got a lot of natural gas now coming from BC. Our system is congested. You're dumping all of that into an Alberta market, can't get out, hence low gas prices. One could argue that frequently we see the constraints affecting agricultural products. So, in the end, these are very serious issues, and just by way of summarize, we mentioned things for you to think about: stabilization, Bill C-48, C-69, stop hurting our resource sector. If you just stop doing that, that would go a long way in terms of stabilization. Competitiveness, regulation, let's look at that, not just from a federal point of view regulation, Alberta's got to do a better job of translating our resource revenues into more stable flow of income through the Heritage Fund or Sovereign Fund. Examine undisciplined transfers. Why is it that so many of these programs, these federal programs, Albertans pay in much more than they can ever get out? Reason is it's subsidizing programs elsewhere. If these are truly insurance programs or intended what the initial purpose was, why is this procurement? Northern Corridor, I want to plug that later. Building a national corridors to allow us to build rail, road, pipelines, transmission facilities. Over to you, Tim.
Yeah, okay. Robert isn't emotional about this at all. I just highbind better. So this is now coming to you, but just in summary, here are the 5 economic goals of a federation and for which we have used as a benchmark in assessing how well the federation is working for us here in Alberta. We focused on the first 3 today during our time here, as we thought it would, first of all, it was time limited, and secondly, we thought these were the most interesting and would be the most interest to you and likely the most topical. We're now going to move into a session requiring your observations and inputs. To facilitate that, we're going to ask you to respond some questions that are on the slide, and it's on your table. So we're going to provide the next 5 to 10 minutes, and Lauren Falkenberg's going to wander around and she's going to ring the bell when you're done. We're just going to go so long. And we're going to ask you to answer the 3, on the 3 that we spoke. How would you score the first 3 federation elements from an Alberta perspective? A meaning good and F being bad, just in case someone wants to ask that question. Secondly, what are the 3 recommendations would you have to improve Alberta's score on the federation that you have marked the lowest? And finally, what recommendations do you have for Alberta to achieve greater stability and prosperity and fiscal viability through the cycles over the long term? You know, we also have some work to do in our own province on some of those issues. So while we talk about the federal part, I think it's also an opportunity to capture some of the thoughts in this room about what we might do better in Alberta as well. So we will ask selective tables to speak to their answers in 10 minutes. Lauren Falkenberg will come around and we'll ask you to quickly speak to what your answers are. We'll ask the first question first of 2 or 3 tables, and then the second one, and then the third. We'd like you to be brief, concise, and say what you believe in and what you'd recommend. We're going to collect all the cards at the end, and we're going to post all of your inputs on the website, because I think this is a good learning opportunity, and this will be shared with some of the public policy people and probably elected officials to give them some help on some ideas that this group might come up with. So with that, it's over to you. You can bring the lights up so the tables can see what they're doing, and we'll ask you to answer those questions.
All right, so let's, first of all, I want to do a very quick vote, and then I will ask different tables for one of their comments. So how many tables gave providing stabilization insurance an A or a B? Okay, I think that's telling. How many gave a D or an F? Okay. Providing regional equity, how many gave an A or a B? All right, D or F? Okay. Consistency. Minimizing trade barriers, D or F? Okay. Oh, was there any C's? Oh, there was a few C's. Okay. That's good, Deb. Okay.
Don't be defensive. Hey, Pierre,
we would like very concise answers because we want to get through all the questions. Table 13. Was there something that you kind of said, this is why we're giving an F or a D to providing stabilization insurance? Table 13.
Good morning. Thank you for allowing us the opportunity to speak. I think the one thing that struck me just as we were watching the presentation that was given is this. A lot of what we see and a lot of the statistics and a lot of the policy is done on a per area basis. And the question that I have is, and the challenge that I have with that is that why isn't it done on a per capita basis? It's pretty hard to argue that things are unfair or that stabilization and insurance is not being met if we just shifted our federal policies from a per area perspective to a per capita perspective.
Perfect. So you've answered the first one and also given us a recommendation in number 3. So that's great. Okay. Raymond James table. What did you think about in promoting regional equity?
I think we had a bit of a mixed response, but I would say, from B to F in some cases here. I think we discussed the healthcare system, and I think the perception at least our table is that our healthcare system is quite good here, and from what everybody's experienced. And anecdotally from some of them have experienced it in different parts of the country through relatives and friends that don't have that positive experience.
All right. So that's one of the reasons for the need to promote regional equity is in the healthcare system. Okay. Minimizing trade barriers. Table 7. Did you have a reason for why you ranked, I'm assuming, a D or an F?
Yeah, so we found that we scored an F for trade barriers, and I guess one of the key issues was premiers who are not compelled or motivated to cooperate. And I don't know what it is what lever you need to pull to actually achieve that better collaboration in our collective interest, but that sure ain't happening right now.
Okay. All right, so
Just as an added comment, there's a lot of barbed wire between the provinces that, like if you're a doctor in one province, you got to get recertified in another province, engineers, it goes on and on. So we've got a lot of barbed wire in our system that goes well beyond pipelines.
Okay. Tim or Robert, do you want to respond to these?
Let me respond to Table 13. This is the question of whether Canada should be a unitary state. In other words, if we were to start over, could we be a unitary state? One level of government that dominates all of the distributional issues, but we're not. We're a federation of provinces and territories, so regions matter. Regions, how, for example, in terms of delivery of healthcare, what you can get in Alberta depends on the economic strength of that particular province, which is in turn a function of all these federal policies. So regions do matter just because we're a federation. If we wanted to be something else, I guess that would be another discussion. Now, that's not to say that individuals and cities don't matter. They do. Those matter as well. But from this is a scorecard on the federation. There's lots of other issues, including strictly provincial issues that need attention. In terms of the barriers, Tim mentioned doctors, but there was an article in the paper not long ago. I was amazed at the cost to get certified in another province, even though at the end of the day, the basic criteria are exactly the same. But I think it was something like, you might remember, $15,000 and a long length of time, and I don't know how many hundreds of pages of documentation. You wouldn't even find this in the European Union, for example, and much larger differences there.
So table 15, so what I'm going to ask you to do is give us one recommendation. The question asks for 3, but what I want to do is go to 3 different tables. So if you could give us your top recommendation to question 2, table 15.
Thank you very much. Without shooting the messenger, our top recommendation was the sales tax implementation for Alberta. And we had a lot of debate around it. We talked about it in terms of promoting regional equity as well, because we think there might be some animosity amongst other provinces that we in Alberta do not have a sales tax. We also saw it as a self-stabilization mechanism. So with apology, that was our number one.
Okay, thank you.
You would argue, Rob, that that would also apply to point 3. Thank you.
Yeah. Table 16. Do you have a spokesperson?
There's too much democracy over there.
I think so.
Just hand the mic to someone.
I'll stand up and do it.
Good
We
man.
talked about a lot of things in terms of just kind of what recommendations we'd have, but just quickly, the two would be apply the Constitution and enforce free trade across. It seems that everyone's picking and choosing in the Constitution what they want, but that would be one, is enforce free trade and remove the barriers across. We shouldn't have to pay to move any sort of product across any border. We allow rail to come west to east, and we should be allowing oil and other products to go east to west. That was kind of one of the big ones.
Thank you. That's great.
All right, and Chinook. Sorry, I didn't get a table number for Chinook. Okay, right there. Yeah, and one of your recommendations.
Yeah, sorry. Real quickly, we sort of melded 3 into one. Agitate to renegotiate equalization and handle that by way of referendum. I think you'll see that next provincial campaign or platform. And educate every Albertan first, which I think in the last 2-3 years we've seen a real push for that. And seminars like this and initiatives like Cody Battershall and Canada Action have been fantastic. I think that press now needs to go beyond Alberta and kind of get through the barbed wire and get to the rest of the country. I think it's starting to resonate, starting to see a little bit more. I think it's probably a little bit more compassion towards the business and the contribution it makes to the Federation more now than ever. And even as an Albertan, I've learned more about what our province does for this country that makes me more proud to be Albertan than ever. So those things, so I know you asked for one, but wanted to get all 3 of them in there as well. So.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
It's
That's
good. It was kept in time. So, Tim or Robert, do you want to respond to what you've just heard?
I think we just want to hear what the folks have to say, and we'll make a couple comments at the end if it's appropriate. Let's go to question 3. Just to reiterate, we do want to collect the cards and put this in a compendium of recommendations, and I think they will find their way to certain people who may be able to have some influence in the future on these questions.
So, okay, table 23. Where's table 23? What recommendation do you have for Alberta to achieve greater stability, prosperity, and fiscal viability?
Okay, well, we didn't really discuss this one, so this is my personal view, I guess.
Okay.
But we could use the Heritage Fund in times of surplus. We need to contribute to it. And in times of deficit, we could withdraw from it. And I think we should make deficits illegal again.
Thank you.
Truly illegal. Okay. All right. Table 19. Do you have a recommendation?
Under items 1, we gave everything an F. What 3 recommendations do you have to improve Alberta's score in the Federation elements you marked lowest? Well, we said reverse C48 and C69. C69 is almost doomed to go through. Then increase the number of MPs Alberta has. We have 12% of the population. We have 6% of the MPs. That's not the exact ratio. That's where we are. We have no political power in this country. We're a sitting duck. We need to get a negotiating position. To do so, we must give a premier the mandate to separate if he cannot get a good deal of Canada. We won't win. We won't win a negotiation unless we've got a strong negotiating position, and we've got to give that to a premier if we want to get going.
Okay, thank you. Now, I'm going to turn to table 2 and say, do you have almost kind of a closing recommendation that you could give us?
So really what Alberta lacks right now is some optionality. on so many different levels. And so we were looking at it from the perspective that Alberta needs to get its fiscal house in order. We need to look at a way to get off that sine wave of variability of resource revenue, relying on that. So of course we go back to the conversation of a sales tax. But we also talked about the fact that we really need to figure out how to resolve the issue of how we don't encourage investment right now. We need to not penalize the energy sector. We need to make sure that there are that the tax structure is such that it encourages investment, but also that the regulatory system is such that it also promotes reliability and encourages the investment that the companies to risk capital. And finally, we were thinking about the issue of the free trade amongst the provinces, the fact that we are stuck trying to get our resources to market east or west, and perhaps we need a reference case. We need Alberta to come forward with a reference case on free trade and to challenge what's already in place so that we can actually establish those rules, not just for Alberta, but for the country.
Okay, thank you. So I think it's been interesting from my perspective to hear the range of recommendations and the thoughtfulness of those recommendations. I'm going to turn it over to Robert and Tim to kind of bring some closing remarks.
Sure. Well, first of all, we'd really like to thank all of you for coming this morning and, more importantly, sharing some of your thoughts and observations. There's some valuable ones that have already been expressed, and we look forward to seeing what you've written, and we will put it in a compendium. You know, one of the things that in that question 3, and I think Deborah was alluding to that in one of her comments, that, you know, having been in the oil and gas business, one of the things that I always believed in is that you had to build your company to be able to, in my words, make a double-digit return at the bottom of the cycle. And I think Alberta, and then when things got better, you had surpluses, and I think Alberta would be well served to figure out the provincial revenues from a bottom of the cycle point of view and build a sustainable provincial enterprise. And as one person said, when times get better, we can put money into the Heritage Fund. And so there are some things we need to do in our own province, as well as I totally support trying to renegotiate a better arrangement in confederation for all provinces, and certainly for the well-being of this province. Robert?
Just by way of summary, I agree with pretty much everything that's been said, that we need to look at all of the programs, and as Ontario and Quebec especially and other provinces are doing, and asking, are they still serving the purpose they were designed for, and are they fair in terms of the distribution of costs and benefits? The whole issue of what Alberta should be doing, I'm reminded about the number of articles that have been put out on using the Heritage Fund to convert unstable resource revenues into a more stable flow of interest and dividends. If we had have done that, we would be sitting on what, depending on the percentage, if we stuck with the original amounts, $100 to $200 billion. The world would look quite different from Alberta's perspective. Now, obviously we didn't do that. The question is, going forward, maybe it's time that we just made some hard decisions, and maybe it's a sales tax to substitute for resource revenues. Start building that Heritage Fund. So this time we'll learn. And also from the point of view of individuals, there's lots of behavior at an individual level that should be changed once you recognize that there is the volatility. Rather than piling on in the good times, maybe hold back a bit so that you've got a bit of ammunition left for the bad times. So there's a combination of those things. The whole area of free trade, it's going to be an ongoing battle. As I mentioned, all the provinces have their list of favorites, although I would like to see, as mentioned I think by Deborah, a test case. I mean, how is it that when you're proposing a pipeline that crosses a border into BC, that it's okay for BC to hold it up for hostage for benefits? And then you start talking about, well, Alberta, maybe we should put a tariff on everything that comes by rail from Vancouver. I mean, this is crazy. Canada isn't even an ocean as opposed to a nation at some point. Anyway, I've said enough. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much for your attendance, and we really appreciate all your feedback.
And I would like to thank both Tim and Robert. They will each get our specially commissioned Haskayne hour clocks. and I'll be able to get those to you after. But thank you very much.